I thought I was driving to my cabin for a quiet weekend alone, the first real rest I had allowed myself in 4 long months. I had packed a small overnight bag, tucked in 2 paperback novels I hadn't found the time to open, and told nobody I was going. What I didn't know, what I couldn't have imagined as I turned off the highway and onto the winding 2-lane road that leads up into the mountains, was that my own son had been letting his wife's entire family use my cabin for the past 6 weeks without a single word to me, treating my most sacred place on earth like a free vacation rental he had some sovereign right to give away. And that was still only the surface of it. Because when I finally pushed open that front door and smelled someone else's food in my kitchen, heard a child's laughter I didn't recognize bouncing off my walls, saw a stranger's boots drying on the mat that had sat beside my door for 22 years, I had no idea that the worst discovery of the evening was still waiting for me in the back room. Tucked inside my own cedar filing cabinet, behind the folder labeled Property Documents, I would find a quitclaim deed, recently notarized, properly formatted, legally terrifying, bearing what appeared to be my signature transferring full ownership of the cabin to my son and his wife, a signature I had never written, a signature close enough to mine to have already passed through a notary's hands, but not close enough to fool the woman who had signed her own name 10,000 times across 58 years of living. My name is Clara Whitfield, and I have owned that cabin since the January my mother passed away and left it to me in a handwritten will that nobody in the family contested, because nobody in the family had ever particularly cared about it except for me and her. It sits on the edge of a narrow glacial lake in the mountains of western North Carolina, about 12 miles from the town of Bryson City, along a gravel road that winds up through a corridor of white pines so tall and dense they turn noon into something closer to dusk. The cabin itself is not grand. It is 3 bedrooms, a kitchen that has never been remodeled, a living room with a stone fireplace that draws imperfectly in wet weather, and a back porch that faces east over the water. My late husband Daniel spent one September rebuilding that back porch from the joists up, after we discovered dry rot the year before he got sick, and he painted the exterior shutters a dark forest green, because he said the color belonged to the mountains, and there was no point in arguing with them. He finished the last shutter on a Friday in early October, climbed down from the ladder, put his hands on my shoulders, and said, "There, now it looks like it means to stay." He was dead 14 months later. I have not changed the color of those shutters since. The cabin was never just property to me. It was the place I went when the noise of my own life became too much, when the hospital where I worked as an administrator for nearly 3 decades demanded more of me than I had left to give, when the anniversaries got hard, when the loneliness that follows grief settled in like cold air under a door. I would make the 2-hour drive and unlock the front door and stand for a moment in the smell of it. Pine sap and old wood and the slight mineral edge of lake water in summer, the dry cedar sweetness of the heating vents in winter. And something in my chest would open like a fist unclenching. The lake was the color of pewter in the mornings and pale green in the afternoons, and in May the dogwoods along the shore came into bloom so completely it looked as though someone had scattered white handkerchiefs across every hillside. I'd been going there for 31 years. I had cried there, healed there, thought through the hardest decisions of my life sitting in the old rocking chair on that east-facing porch, with coffee going cold in my hand and the sun lifting itself slowly above the ridgeline. My son Jason had grown up with the cabin as a constant in his life. He knew every corner of it. The drawer in the kitchen that stuck unless you lifted it slightly while pulling, the bathroom tile that rang hollow under your heel, the specific third floorboard from the top of the staircase that would groan like a living thing at any hour of the night. He had spent summers there as a boy, learned to fish off the dock, cried on that porch after his first serious breakup at 22, called me from the driveway once when he was 29 just to say he'd driven up on a whim because he needed to think. He knew what the cabin was to me. He'd told me once, sitting across from me at the kitchen table with his coffee, that he hoped the place would stay in the family for 100 years after us both. I had reached across and pressed his hand and meant it more than he could have known. He married Diane Horton 3 years ago, and I paid for more of that wedding than I have ever told anyone. The venue, a portion of the catering, the bridesmaid flowers, when the florist's quote came in 20% higher than expected. I did it willingly, without scorekeeping, because that is how I was raised and because I liked Diane well enough. She was efficient and poised in the way of a person who has always understood that composure is a kind of currency. She sent thank you notes within 24 hours, remembered allergy information, arrived at gatherings with the right bottle of wine and a prepared opinion about the host's new furniture. In the early months of their marriage, I found her slightly exhausting in the pleasant way of someone who makes you feel faintly underprepared, but I never found her unkind. It was her mother, Patricia, who began to recalibrate things for me. Diane's family, Patricia and Gerald Horton, and their younger daughter Kelsey with her husband Rob and their 5-year-old son Beau, operated as what I can only describe as a unit. They arrived to family events in convoy and left in convoy. They communicated through a group text with a name I was never added to. Patricia was a small, energetic woman in her mid-60s who wore linen regardless of the season and had the kind of smile that was always precisely 1 degree warmer than her eyes. She called me Clara from our very first introduction without asking whether I preferred it, and she had a way of touching a person's forearm when she wanted something. A light, lingering press of her fingers, practiced and deliberate, that was engineered to feel like affection and functioned as a form of navigation. She asked questions constantly, careful, lateral questions that arrived in the middle of normal conversation, like objects placed strategically on a table. How long had I owned the cabin? Was it difficult to manage the maintenance alone? Had I ever considered a property manager? Whether I used it year-round or primarily in summer? What the property taxes were running these days, with values going up the way they were? I told myself she was a planner. I was a planner, too. I answered her questions without thinking too carefully about the pattern they formed. The first specific moment of unease arrived about 8 months before I made that May drive. It was a Tuesday evening in late September, and I was in my kitchen warming soup. I wasn't particularly hungry when my phone lit up with Jason's name. Jason texted. He did not call without reason. I noticed the small, involuntary tightening in my stomach as I wiped my hands and answered, and I noticed it, and I put it aside. He asked if I had been using the cabin recently. I told him I hadn't been up since August, which was true. He said he hoped I wasn't letting it sit empty going into the cold months, that empty properties in the mountains could deteriorate over winter, that pipes and gutters needed attention. This was not unreasonable. We talked about the gutters for a few minutes, about whether I should call the handyman in Bryson City who had fixed the deck railing 2 summers back, and then the conversation found its natural end, and we said goodnight. And I stood in my kitchen a moment after hanging up, holding the phone loosely, looking at nothing in particular. I thought about that call the next morning. There had been something in his voice that I couldn't name at the time and can name very clearly now. The particular evenness of a person who has rehearsed a casual tone. Not nervousness, exactly. The absence of the small, accidental music that real casualness carries. I turned the thought over twice and set it down because I had learned across 34 years of mothering that the fears you manufacture about your children rarely resemble the actual trouble when it arrives. 3 weeks later, Diane sent me a text message. It was a photograph of the cabin, taken from the bottom of the driveway, the forest green shutters half hidden in early autumn color, a morning mist sitting low over the water behind it. The whole image unsettlingly beautiful. Underneath, she had written, "Such a beautiful piece of family history. We're so lucky to have it." I read that message 4 times, each time trying to locate the exact source of the discomfort it produced in me. Family history was unremarkable. We're so lucky to have it was the part that snagged. Not you, not you're so lucky to have it, or even we're all so lucky you have it. Just we, as in, this belongs to us. I composed and deleted 3 different responses before settling on something brief and warm and non-committal, and I did not say anything to anyone about it. The credit card alert came in March. I kept a specific card for the cabin, utilities, the annual fire insurance, maintenance calls, and in the first week of March, a charge appeared from a grocery store in Bryson City, $43.78. I had not been to the cabin. I had not authorized any charges. I had not spoken to anyone about the cabin in weeks. I stood in my front hallway with the February light falling low and pale across the wood floor, and I stared at that charge for a long time, the way you stare at something your brain is refusing to process correctly. Then I called Jason. He answered on the second ring. His voice was easy, unhurried. He said, "Oh, right, sorry, I should have mentioned. Diane and I went up for a long weekend, just to get some air. I can absolutely pay you back for anything we use from the kitchen." I told him it was fine. Of course it was fine. He was my son, and the cabin had always been open to him. Just let me know in future so I wasn't startled by the card activity. He said he would. He said, "Absolutely, Mom, of course." And I believed him, because I needed to believe him, because the alternative, the thing my body was already beginning to understand while my mind held it at arm's length, was too specifically terrible to consider on a quiet Tuesday morning in March. What I did not know, standing in that hallway, was that Diane's entire family had been going up to the cabin on rotating weekends since January. What I did not know was that there was a spare key, a copy cut from the one that had hung on my own key ring, the one Jason had borrowed briefly last December to, he told me, check on the pipes, hanging on a hook in Patricia Horton's kitchen in Asheville, 60 miles from my house. What I did not know was that Patricia had used those winter visits to photograph the interior of the cabin carefully and systematically. The original deed I had framed and hung on the living room wall, the cedar filing cabinet where I kept my property documents, the layout of the rooms, the view from the back porch. What I did not know was that she had spent those same months researching the mechanics of a quitclaim deed under North Carolina property law, specifically the kind that transfers ownership between family members, requires only the grantor's signature, a notary stamp, and filing with the county register of deeds. I didn't know any of this on the first Friday of May when I decided spontaneously to make the drive. The dogwoods would be in full bloom. The air would smell of cold water and new leaves. I had just come through a difficult stretch at work. We were mid-transition with a new record system. and I needed the specific quiet of that east-facing porch and the sound of nothing but wind and water and the occasional outboard motor somewhere on the far side of the lake. I packed my overnight bag. I put my 2 paperbacks on the passenger seat. I did not call ahead because it was my property, and I had never needed to announce myself to enter my own home. The drive takes 2 hours and 11 minutes from my front door when the roads are clear. I know because I have made it so many times across 3 decades that my hands turn the wheel before my eyes register the curves. I came around the last bend of the gravel approach at just past 4 in the afternoon, the light going gold and long through the pines, the lake visible in bright fragments between the trees. And I saw the cars, 4 of them, arranged along the flat ground in front of the cabin with the comfortable familiarity of objects that have been in the same place for days. Kelsey's silver SUV nearest the door, Patricia and Gerald's dark blue sedan alongside it. A white truck I didn't recognize pulled up close to the woodpile, and Jason's car, my son's car, in the spot closest to the porch steps, as settled and unremarkable as if it had been parked there every weekend of his adult life. I stopped my car at the edge of the clearing and sat with the engine running and looked at all of this. The late afternoon light came through the windshield and lay warm across my hands on the wheel, and I watched a child's silhouette cross back and forth behind the front window, and heard, faintly through the glass and the distance, the sound of Gerald's low voice and the clink of dishes and the particular domestic fullness of a household settling in for an evening. Every sound was ordinary. Every sound was wrong. I turned off the engine. I sat in the new silence for what might have been 2 minutes or might have been 10. Then I reached for my phone, not quite deciding to, and opened Jason's last text message, a photograph of a sandwich sent 2 Sundays ago, captioned "Weekend Lunch Game Strong," and I looked at it for a long time. Then I put the phone in my pocket and I walked to my own front door and I knocked. Kelsey answered. She was wearing my kitchen apron, the old blue cotton one with the frayed pocket that had hung on the same hook beside the stove since 2009. And she had flour on her right forearm and a look on her face that moved through 4 distinct expressions in under 2 seconds. Recognition, something sharp and involuntary that I can only describe as alarm, the rapid reassembly of composure, and then a wide, bright smile that arrived about half a beat too late to be anything other than performance. "Clara," she said with the warmth of a person who is prepared for this exact moment. "Oh my goodness, we had no idea you were coming. Please, come in, come in." She stepped back. I stepped forward, and I stood in the doorway of my cabin and saw what had been made of it. The cabin smelled like Patricia's perfume. That was the first thing I registered. Not the rearranged furniture, not the children's drawings taped to my refrigerator, not the row of unfamiliar shoes lined up along the baseboard beneath the coat hooks where Daniel's old fishing vest still hung. It was the perfume. Something floral and synthetic and aggressively present, the kind of scent that doesn't drift through a room so much as occupy it. It had soaked into the curtains. I could smell it over the wood smoke and the pine and the cold lake mineral cleanness that had been the smell of this place for as long as I had owned it, and the displacement of that smell, the simple fact of its replacement by something foreign and powdery and wrong, hit me harder than anything else in those first seconds. Patricia was marking territory the way animals do. I understood this instantly and said nothing. Gerald was in the armchair by the fireplace, my armchair, the one I had reupholstered in dark green fabric 3 years ago, into which he had settled with the proprietorial ease of a man in his own home. He looked up at me over his reading glasses and said, "Clara, what a surprise." in a voice that contained no surprise at all. Bo, Kelsey's 5-year-old, was lying on his stomach on my braided rug with a tablet, not looking up. Rob, Kelsey's husband, stood in the kitchen doorway with a dish towel over his shoulder, and he gave me a nod that was carefully calibrated to suggest that none of this was unusual. Diane was on the couch with her legs folded beneath her and a glass of white wine in her hand, and she looked at me with those clear, assessing eyes and offered a smile that did not apologize for a single thing. And then Jason came down the stairs. He was in a flannel shirt I recognized from Christmas and thick wool socks, and he stopped on the 3rd step from the bottom, the one that groaned, the one he had known groaned since he was 10 years old. And he looked at me, and the thing I saw on his face was not guilt exactly. It was something more exhausted than guilt. It was the face of a person who's been waiting for something to happen and is relieved, in a complicated way, that it finally has. "Mom," he said. Just that. "Jason." I kept my voice completely flat. I had learned across nearly 3 decades in hospital administration that a flat voice in a tense room does more work than any raised one. "Would you like to explain what's happening here?" He came down the last 3 steps and stood with his hands in his pockets, and he said the thing I had already known he would say. "I should have told you. I know. We needed somewhere for the family to gather, and I thought, with you not using it regularly, I thought it would be okay." He paused. "I'm sorry I didn't call." I looked at him for a long moment. Behind me, Kelsey had retreated to the kitchen and was making sounds with dishes, the specific busy hands performance of a person removing themselves from a conversation while remaining close enough to hear it. Gerald had not moved. Diane had not moved. The wine in her glass caught the late light from the window and threw a pale shadow across the arm of my sofa. "How long?" I said. "A few weekends," he said. Then, after a pause that told me everything, 6 weeks, roughly. 6 weeks. On and off, not every weekend. I turned and looked at Gerald, still in the armchair. He met my eyes pleasantly, a man with nothing to answer for. I looked at Diane, who smoothed her expression into something sympathetic and waiting. I looked at Bo on the rug, innocent and entirely absorbed in his screen. I looked at the shelf above the fireplace, where I kept a small collection of things that mattered to me. A framed photograph of Daniel and me on this very porch, a piece of green sea glass my mother had found on a beach in Maine, a ceramic owl Jason had made for me in 3rd grade, and I noticed that the photograph had been moved to make room for a scented candle, Patricia's brand, the same scent that was currently inhabiting the air. The photograph was now propped slightly sideways against the wall behind the candle, as though it had been nudged aside to make room and not thought about again. It was the photograph that did it, not the cars outside, not the strangers on my furniture, not even the flour-dusted apron on Kelsey's arm. The photograph of Daniel, tilted sideways, secondary to a candle that someone had purchased and placed in its space without a moment's consideration. That was the thing that moved something in me from shock to something much colder and more deliberate. "Where is Patricia?" I asked. "She's in the back bedroom," Diane said. Her voice was careful and modulated, the tone of a therapist or a diplomat. "She's resting. She had a long drive." The back bedroom was my bedroom, the room with the cedar filing cabinet. I don't fully remember walking across the living room and down the short hallway. I remember the feel of the hallway floorboards under my shoes, and the sound of the television from around the corner, and the smell of the perfume getting stronger. And then I was opening the door of my bedroom, and Patricia Horton was inside it, sitting upright on my bed in a cream-colored linen blouse, reading from her phone with reading glasses perched on the end of her nose, and she looked up at me with an expression of such total, unruffled composure that for one vertiginous moment I thought I had somehow made a mistake, had walked into the wrong room, the wrong house, the wrong life. "Clara," she said. She did not stand. "We weren't expecting you." "No," I said. "I don't imagine you were." She took her reading glasses off and folded them carefully and placed them on her knee. "I hope you don't mind us making ourselves comfortable. Jason said you hadn't been up in some time, and with the property sitting empty, it seemed such a shame." She smiled. The smile arrived on her face with perfect timing, warm and slightly sorrowful, the smile of a woman who finds herself perpetually misunderstood through no fault of her own. "We've been taking good care of it." I looked around the room. My bedding had been replaced. She had brought her own, a white duvet that made the room look like a rental property. My books from the nightstand had been stacked on the floor to make room for her water glass and her hand cream and a small travel clock, and the cedar filing cabinet in the corner, the one I kept locked, the one where I stored the original deed and the mortgage records and Daniel's insurance paperwork, was slightly open. The small key was in the lock. I had not left that cabinet unlocked. I had not left a key in that lock. I kept the key on my key ring, the same ring as the cabin key, the same ring that had been on my person for every day of the past 11 years. My feet carried me to the cabinet before my thoughts caught up with them. I pulled the drawer open fully, and my fingers found the folder labeled Property, Cabin in my own handwriting, and I opened it, and there was my original deed, exactly where it should have been. But behind it, behind the deed I had owned and held and paid taxes on for 31 years, was a document I had never seen. A quitclaim deed, North Carolina standard form, 2 pages, transferring ownership of the property, the parcel number, the lake frontage, the access road, all of it described precisely. From Clara Ann Whitfield to Jason Daniel Whitfield and Diane Marie Horton Whitfield as joint tenants with rights of survivorship, dated 3 weeks ago, notarized with an official seal and a notary's signature I didn't recognize, and at the bottom of the signature line for the grantor, for me, a signature, my name, in my handwriting, or something close enough to my handwriting that a person who had never stood at my shoulder while I wrote would not have questioned it. I have never in my life described the physical sensation of the ground disappearing from beneath your feet as anything other than a cliché. I understand it now. It is not dramatic or metaphorical. It is a literal, specific bodily phenomenon. A loss of pressure under the soles, a sudden absence of the ordinary weight of standing on something solid. My right hand was gripping the edge of the filing cabinet, and my left was holding the document, and the room had gone very bright at the edges and very still at the center, the way a photograph looks when the flash is too strong. I was aware of my own heartbeat in a way I am almost never aware of it, a hard and rapid presence in my throat and my temples. I was aware of Patricia, 3 feet behind me, not speaking. I turned around. She was still sitting on the bed, upright, watching me with the same careful composure. The reading glasses were back in her hand, turning slowly between her fingers. "You should sit down," she said. "You forged my signature," I said. My voice came out completely steady. I was distantly amazed by this. She tilted her head very slightly. "Clara, I know this looks surprising. I think we should wait for Jason to come in and talk through this properly, like adults. There's been a lot of thought put into this, and I want to explain. You forged my signature on a property transfer document, I said again, because I needed to hear the words outside my own skull, needed them to exist in the air of the room so that they were real and not something my mind had constructed. You forged it. You had it notarized. You put it in my filing cabinet. The notary was presented with proper identification, Patricia said, and the precision of that statement, the way it neither confirmed nor denied, the way it navigated around the truth like water around a stone, told me that this was not a woman who had acted impulsively. This was a woman who had prepared for this conversation, who had thought through what to say and what not to say, and had perhaps even consulted someone about the legal architecture of what she had done. I walked out of the bedroom, down the hallway, into the living room where Jason was still standing with his hands in his pockets, and Diane was still on the sofa, and Gerald was still in the armchair, and the whole scene had the arranged quality of something staged. "Jason," I said, "did you know about this document?" He looked at me. He looked at Diane. He looked at his hands. The silence lasted 5 full seconds, and in those 5 seconds I learned everything I needed to know about my son's complicity in what had been done to me. "Mom," he said, "it's not what you think." "Tell me what it is." "It was supposed to be. It was a planning thing. For the future." "Mom, you're 58, and the cabin is going to come to me eventually anyway, and Patricia said if we formalized it now, it would save on estate complications later, and I thought it was just paperwork. I didn't think." "You thought what?" My voice was still level, still that terrifying flatness. "You thought your mother's signature would appear on a legal document by itself?" He said nothing. "You gave her access to my filing cabinet." Still nothing. He was looking at the floor with the expression of a man who has known for some time that a collision was coming and is experiencing its arrival as something close to relief. Diane, on the sofa, had gone very still. She was watching me with those clear eyes, and I understood, looking at her, that this had been her mother's plan, but not only her mother's plan. Patricia had conceived it. Patricia had executed it. But Diane had known, and Diane had said nothing, and that was its own kind of signature. "How long has your mother been planning this?" I asked Diane directly. A pause. Then, "She mentioned it before the wedding, actually." Diane said it evenly, without apology. She had apparently decided that the moment for performance was past. She thought it made sense to secure the asset while there was a clear family structure in place. Before the wedding. Before she had even become my daughter-in-law, Patricia Horton had been devising a mechanism to remove my property from my ownership and transfer it to her daughters. The careful questions at Thanksgiving, the text message about family history, the spare key borrowed and copied, all of it assembled over years with the patience of someone who understood that the best way to take something from a person is to let them trust you first. I picked up my bag from where I had set it by the door. I took the quitclaim deed from the cabinet. I had carried it with me down the hall without realizing, and I put it in my bag. Then I looked at my son. "Do not come to this cabin again," I said. "Do not send anyone to this cabin. If any of you are here when I return with the people I'm about to call, you will be trespassing on private property." Jason said, "Mom," and Patricia came out of the hallway and said, "Clara, let's be reasonable." And Gerald finally stood up from the armchair, but I had already opened the front door and I was already walking through it, and the evening air hit me like cold water. clean and sharp and smelling of pine and lake and the specific North Carolina mountain dusk that I had loved for 31 years. And I kept walking until I reached my car. I sat in the driver's seat with the document on my lap and my phone in my hand, and I called my attorney. Martin Chu had handled my house purchase and Daniel's estate and 3 other matters over 20 years, and he answered on the 4th ring because it was a Friday evening, and I told him what I was holding and what it said, and he went very quiet in the particular way that lawyers go quiet when they are thinking quickly. He told me not to touch the notary seal with my bare hands any more than I already had. He told me to photograph every page immediately. He told me that forging a grantor's signature on a quitclaim deed in North Carolina was a Class 1 felony, minimum, and that a fraudulently obtained notarization compounded it considerably. He said, "Don't go back in tonight. Drive somewhere and get some rest. I'll have my investigator make some calls in the morning." I photographed every page under the dome light of my car, the flash bleaching the notary's seal into perfect clarity. Then I drove to the motel in Bryson City, 12 miles down the mountain, a clean and ordinary room that smelled of industrial laundry detergent and nothing else. And I sat on the edge of the bed and let myself, finally, feel the full weight of what the evening had brought. Not the forgery, not Patricia's careful composure on my bed in my bedroom, not even the document itself. What I felt, sitting in that anonymous room with the mountain dark outside the window, was the specific and irreplaceable grief of a trust that cannot be repaired. My son had given a stranger a key to the most sacred place in my life. He had allowed his mother-in-law to photograph my personal documents. He had, when asked directly, looked at the floor. He was 34 years old, and he had stood in my living room and chosen in the clearest possible way to let this happen. And no legal outcome, no felony charge, no deed reversal, no courtroom victory was going to give back the thing I had lost when I saw his face in those 5 seconds of silence. Martin's investigator called me back the following Monday. What he found was thorough and, by that point, unsurprising. The notary whose seal appeared on the document was a licensed notary public in Buncombe County, who had subsequently admitted, when the investigator made contact, that she had been hired privately by Patricia Horton and had notarized the document based on an identification card presented alongside what appeared to be the property deed. The identification had been a driver's license, bearing my name and Patricia's photograph, obtained, the investigator believed, through a document printing service operating out of a strip mall in Asheville. Patricia Horton had put considerable money and effort into this. She had not been improvising. The criminal complaint was filed that Tuesday. The Register of Deeds in Swain County confirmed that the fraudulent deed had not yet been officially filed. It had been prepared and waiting, which meant that Patricia had intended to file it after my death or incapacitation, or perhaps after maneuvering me into a position where contesting it would be difficult. Martin told me this was a pattern he had seen before, more often than I would expect. Adult children and their spouses cultivating access to aging parents' property, laying groundwork over years. He did not say this to comfort me. He said it because it was true, and he had learned that people who had been betrayed by family found truth more useful than consolation. Patricia Horton was arrested 6 weeks later. The charge was forgery of a deed in North Carolina, a Class 1 felony, plus identity fraud for the fabricated driver's license. She made bail the same afternoon and retained a defense attorney who immediately began constructing a narrative about mental confusion and misunderstanding. but Martin had already secured a forensic document analyst whose report confirmed that the signature on the deed had been traced from a sample Patricia had photographed from a document she found in my filing cabinet during one of her unsupervised visits to my cabin. The analyst's comparison was unambiguous. The case, Martin told me, was solid. Gerald retained his own attorney and claimed ignorance. Kelsey stopped answering her phone. Diane filed for a trial separation from Jason 3 weeks after the arrest, which I had not anticipated, and which told me more about the architecture of that marriage than anything Jason had ever confided. He called me from a parking lot at 10 o'clock on a Thursday night, crying in the particular way of someone who has held it back for too long, and I answered because he was still my son, even though I had not yet decided what that meant for us going forward. I listened. I said very little. At the end, I said, "You're going to have to figure out who you are, Jason, not who she wanted you to be and not who I want you to be. You." He cried for another minute, and then he said, "Okay, I don't know what he did with that. I hope he did something." I went back to the cabin on a Saturday in late July. I drove up alone, the way I always had, in the early morning when the mist was still sitting on the water and the light was pale gold through the white pines. I brought my own coffee in a thermos and the 2 paperback novels I had never managed to open. I parked in my spot and sat for a moment with the windows down, listening. Bird song, wind in the high branches, the soft mechanical knock of a woodpecker somewhere in the tree line. My own breathing, slow and even. I had called a cleaner before I came, and they had come and gone, and the cabin smelled like itself again. Pine and wood and old furniture and the faint mineral sweetness from the lake. The white duvet was gone. My books were back on the nightstand, Patricia's candle had been removed from the shelf, and Daniel's photograph was upright again, him and me on the back porch in October sunlight, his paint-stained hands around a coffee cup, both of us laughing at something just out of frame. I stood in front of it for a long time. I replaced the lock on the front door. I had the locksmith cut 1 key, which I put on my ring. 1 key, mine. Then I made coffee from the thermos and took it out to the back porch and sat in the old rocking chair and watched the lake come into the morning. The dogwoods were long past bloom by July, but the water was the pale green it turned in summer, and the ridgeline above the far shore was the dense, layered green of Daniel's shutters, and the air was cool enough to require a sweater and warm enough not to need a heavier one. A heron stood motionless in the shallows at the north end of the dock, and then, without apparent reason, lifted itself into the air with long, unhurried wing beats and crossed the lake and disappeared into the tree line on the other side. I thought about my mother, who had left me this place. I thought about Daniel, who had made the porch I was sitting on and painted the shutters the color he said belonged to the mountain. I thought about 31 years of this view, this air, this specific quality of light on this particular water, and how none of that had been altered by what had been attempted here. The cabin was still mine. The deed was still mine. The morning was still mine. Some things can be taken from you. Property, trust, the simple luxury of believing that the people closest to you are who they appear to be. But the capacity to sit alone with something you love and let it fill you, that, I had learned, is something you can only surrender yourself. Nobody can forge their way to it. Nobody can photograph it out of a filing cabinet and transfer it to their own name. I opened one of the paperbacks. I didn't read it for a long time. I just sat with it open in my lap and watched the light move on the water, and I let the silence be exactly what it was. Mine.